But no, it was interesting just having that conversation that we had last time. Obviously, I want to pick up on a few more of the things that we talked about in a bit more detail.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, for anyone watching, just so we know who you are, it's Dr. Chris Clayton, and you are head of Academy Nutrition at Newcastle United. Did I get that correct?
That's correct.
Cool. Could we start just by giving me a little bit more of a summary or background of exactly what that means, what that is that you do at Newcastle? Give a bit
Yeah,
about
so
yourself, background.
I mean, where do you want to go? Right from the beginning through to that, or
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. Talk about the doctor part first.
yeah, I mean, so I started way back in 2007, I think it was, when I started doing my undergrad degree, and that was in sports science. I graduated from there and moved straight into doing my master's degree, and I'd done that at Northumbria, in nutrition and biochemistry. And alongside that, I worked in leisure. So I worked for Gated Council. I was working at Gated Stadium for a long time, um, and went from like casual leisure attendant, gym instructor into more senior roles. Excuse me, and then became a little bit of a little bit of a challenge because it was like, right, now I've got this master's degree in um, nutrition and biochemistry with sports science, something I've always wanted to do, but now I've got a decent job here. I'm
Yeah,
getting paid all right money. So I didn't know, I was at that crossroads and not knowing what to do. And anyway, around about 2016, maybe I made that decision to move into education. And I went in there just as what you call a progression coach. So just helping sort of like academic support. Took a big jump because I went from earning very good money down to earning not a great deal of money, but I knew it was something. Education was what I always wanted to do. And I'd done that for about 12 months before then starting to do my PGCE, excuse me, and moved into teaching. So started as a lecturer at Newcastle College and further education whilst doing my PGCE, and then moved into higher education once I'd done that, and then started with the PhD. Um, Thought there was an opportunity there for us to do it. Really interested in research. It was what I taught a lot in higher education, was research methods in sport. So yeah, embarked on that journey for 6.5 years. Um, Anyone that decides to want to do a PhD, either you want to be interested in it or it will consume you, and it literally does consume you. But um, Managed to get through that, and then in about April 2022, one of my roles was to revalidate and rewrite degree programs, and sports science came up, and I thought, right, we need to do something here. It seems a bit dated. So I went and spoke to the head of sports science and medicine at Newcastle, and it was just purely around, right, how can I make this degree program what people want in the industry from elite sport, or even, just the general foundations of sports science. Went really well. And then about 6 months later, I got a phone call from a number I don't know. Normally, I don't answer them. So I looked and I thought, I'm not answering that. Sure enough, for whatever reason, answered it. And it was the head of sports science and medicine at Newcastle, who was like, look, there's a job coming out. Just thought I'd let you know, see if you want to apply for it. And it was part time. So I knew I'd have to then go part time in teaching and part time with Newcastle. But I thought it was a really good blend and a unique opportunity to be able to then bridge and take that scientific knowledge and put it into practice and see how it actually works for myself. So yeah, made that decision, and then it's been onwards and upwards from there. Went into that full time, moved through into lead academy nutritionist, and then into head of academy nutrition. So um, really good decision in the end. And I always believe that you've got to make them tough decisions. If it's truly what you want to do, just go for it. Because you'll regret it if not, and it's worked out. So yeah,
Well, I had a very similar story. I worked in marketing for a lot of years. Worked for the same company for 17 years, and I got paid well. It was an okay job, but it wasn't where my heart was.
yeah,
And I was always interested in the training and learning about the nutrition side and everything else. I was coaching a few friends, and when redundancy came up, especially in my late 40s, it was like, if I don't do it now, like, that's it. It's either you do it now or you don't do it at all.
Yeah.
So I took the leap as well. But it's really interesting to hear just how you've gone through all the different stages, kind of blended from one thing into another, but eventually got to where you want to be. But you're quite right in saying as well, if it's not something you're passionate about, you're going to find it very, very difficult to go all in.
No, definitely. And I suppose when we move that away from a PhD and into the fitness and nutrition industry, if you're not passionate about it, it will consume you because there's so much that goes on in there in terms of the knowledge, the research, and then the misinformation that gets fired around, and then ultimately the biggest challenge in research when it comes to applied research is working with free living individuals, and it's the same when you're in practice because humans are complex and they come with a lot of complexities. If it was straightforward, then ultimately it would be a very easy industry. But I think that's the beauty of it, and I think that's what makes it so interesting. That's what makes it engaging because yourself working with client A and then client B is vastly different, and then it can be vastly different with the same client. Because circumstances of each individual change at any given moment. So I think that's what makes it unique, makes it special. And there's always a discussion to be had, and that's what I love. There's always a discussion around an aspect of training, psychology, nutrition, sports science, S&C, whatever it might be. There's always a conversation to be had. And you can talk about one topic and you can be on it for months.
Yeah.
And then we have this position stand or a statement around, right, we do X and Y happens. And then the following day, research then comes out and says, actually, we might have got that wrong. It's now this.
We got a good example of
that. A good example, it could be, if we look at body composition, and again, it is sort of classed as the gold standard. So if we look at DEXA ray, which is the gold standard of body composition measures, but when we dig a little bit deeper, it's still each machine. We found there's differences with each machine. The algorithm and software differences produce different results, and the beam that's used, so the beam that comes over you, it's called a fan beam or a pencil beam, and either one of them can give different results. So there's a lot of consensus now around actually is skin fold calipers just as informative, and we're almost maybe going back.
I think my problem with skin fold calipers is everyone's body's so uniquely different that if you were to try and create a formula around measurements A, B, C, D, E, and F, and then you work out whatever it is, how you work it out, produce a result. Well, my body's completely different to someone else's, and where I've got kind of skin or fat deposited where somebody else has is also completely different. So, like, how accurate is that as well? I guess
obviously you've
comparing one person to another one is probably wrong, but as long as you're using the same tools to measure yourself,
absolutely,
then you are going to get
and body composition is unique to that person for them reasons that you've said. But also what we tend not to do is we don't then transfer it into a percentage because that's based on a predictive equation, and the equations are set between different population groups. So you couldn't use a non-athletic female predictive equation on a male or on an adolescent. So you've got to keep it as total millimeters. But again, you've got inter-rater reliability where somebody there is discrepancies to 2 to 3 mil, which can have a huge difference. But if it's individualized, we're tracking it over time and we're aligning that to performance metrics, then it probably does render itself to being a useful tool. Whereas DEXA becomes very expensive. It's not widely available. And again, it's probably the gold standard for bone mineral density measures. Like that's what we use it essentially for. But it does give you an accurate measure of body fat, but we have to consider all those things that we spoke about there, that it has to be the same machine, the same software and algorithm, the same beam.
I think people get hung up on it as well. I got asked the other day, like, what do you think you're down to now? Do you think you're in single figures? And I said, I would like to think so, but my scales are telling me I'm 17%. If I switch off athlete mode, it's 30%, and I've been in
Yeah,
one of those in-body ones that's told me I'm 9%. So it's all over the place.
yeah. I think it's a good point actually when we talk about body composition. It was one of the aspects of my PhD, and it's one of the aspects of some of the post grad research that I've been looking at. In um, we can look at air displacement, which is a bod pod. We can look at bioelectrical impedance, DEXA rate, predictive equations. There's all sorts of different ways that we can do it. I think it's around being consistent. So we're consistently using the same approach and using it over time as a guide, and not necessarily a definitive is that is exactly where you're at. I think that's what would be a useful way of doing that, and ultimately, again, not get too hung up on the outputs, because unless you've measured yourself at the same time of day, or you've had the same meals, you're free from illness, you haven't overslept, underslept, because if we look at bioelectrical impedance, if you've had more sodium the day before, well, there's going to be an impact there on water balance, so that's going to give you a different reading. Again, with bod pod, there's so many different things can happen in a bod pod. I don't know if you've ever seen one or been in one. They're horrific things. They look like eggs. You just pull this thing down, makes a lot of horrible noises. You're in there for about 15 minutes, and
I mean, we've got that thing at the minute last week with the heat.
well, yeah, exactly.
Everyone's weight was going wild because of the heat and water
Yeah,
retention.
yeah. So you've got to consider all of those things, because I know what happens, and you'll see this as well when somebody does some form of body composition measure and it's off, and then there's a complete meltdown, and thinking things aren't working, or they've done something wrong, and it may be those things that we've just discussed.
Yeah, I do see it a lot. I have it myself. No one's immune to it.
No.
It's easy to take a subjective view on someone else, but when it's your own, you
Oh
still
yeah, I know what you mean.
you still have the same you still have the
Yeah.
same things about it. Um, I get asked the question quite a few times. How many more pounds do you think I need to lose before I'm at this point or at this point? Like, I simply can't tell you. It's
Yeah.
You've just got to get there and then have a look and see. And if there's more to come off, there's more to come off. If there isn't, there isn't. It's so difficult to try and predict somebody's future. Well, let's say I think you've got 8 more pounds to lose, and then you're good, and then we can reverse or do something else. It's like I really don't know. And then
Yeah.
until you get there, you might get another stone off, and then go, hang on a minute, I'm nowhere near. I'm literally nowhere near where I thought I was going to be. Right, we're going to have to go again then.
Yeah.
It can be disheartening when you do rely on numbers.
Oh, and I can see why. I can definitely see why. I think because the consensus over the years, and ultimately when we talk about causation or cause and effect, then we need some form of quantifiable, data to be able to do that. But I think in our industry, weight has become the big thing in general, and obviously it becomes very important when we start then looking at performance and different aspects of sport, whether it's performance based sport, whether it's aesthetics, whatever it might be. We need to have that sort of quantifiable number to be able to work towards. I think the thing that I do is more working towards a process driven goal. So I get that as well. Like, what do you think my ideal weight should be? And you can't then turn around and just go, well, we're not a weight category sport. So because that instantly tells you something about the athlete. It tells you that they're driven, or that they're very conscious around that number that's on the scale. So you have to package ultimately how you speak and engage with them around, right, this is what we're going to do, and it's going to be very goal based driven. So it might be, right, what we want is we want the skin fold measurements to come down, and we want your weight to come down with it, and we'll just look at how that is over the next couple of weeks and put a few little things in place. So it might be that they have an issue with snacking. It may be that they consume most of their calories at night, and it leads to overeating. So it's around, like, what's the process driving the numbers. Getting that bit right ultimately then allows you to educate the person or the people in front of you around what them numbers actually mean, because some people do. And there's a big thing around body composition it gets labelled as body fats. But that's not what that is. Like, we're not looking at body fat. What we're doing is we're trying to separate what that weight number tells us into lean mass and fat mass. Again, we have to remember that when we're doing that, particularly with skin fold calipers, that when we talk about fat-free mass, that is everything that is not subcutaneous fat. So that's still all your organs. That's still, bones. That isn't pure muscle. So if you want to then look at that, we have to make sure that we're keeping that in mind. But that, I think, is a more of a practitioner thing as opposed to unless you would judge whether your client or your athlete needed to know that. But you can confuse people with it, and they start getting a little bit confused. So to keep it simple, that's why I think we look at fat mass and then fat-free mass.
Yeah. Just going back a step, you're talking about misinformation, and of which there's plenty.
Yeah.
We touched on this last time about, what are the biggest pointers of misinformation, or even like what you would say false beliefs are within people in general, or even athletes, even the people that you work with. What are the kind of things that you see on the internet so often that's just you're shaking your head in disbelief?
There's quite a few, and it still baffles us, and I get it because, and I'm still not efficient, fantastic with social media. I know we had that discussion the other day where, I'm still very, I would say, new to it. But some of the stuff I do see where I think to myself, how is this still a thing? And then you've got to sort of take a step back, haven't you? And you've got to think, right, okay, take away what you know, remove yourself from it, and then just look at it as a consumer. And I can see why it starts this spiral of coming back round. So the bit I'm getting at here is carbs make you fat, but I can see where that might come from, because if we start talking about different aspects of diet, and so intermittent fasting, it's an aspect of a nutritional approach where, it may promote, fat loss. So then I can see why somebody would then think, well, if I cut out carbs and I lose fat, well, if I have carbs, it must make us fat. I can see what happens, but that's ultimately just not how the body works. And it's an important macronutrient for high intensity exercise.
It's brain as well.
The brain goes. But yeah, and that's not to say that keto can't work, by the way, when we talk about ketone bodies and fueling the brain and stuff like that. But like, carbs will not make you fat. Ultimately, over consuming any macronutrient will, make you fat. And it comes back to that, calorie or energy balance. And I think it's because it just doesn't, it's not trendy. It doesn't sit with, this new approach. But like, ultimately, energy balance is where it happens when we talk about the foundations. And I think people don't like having foundations. I think they need something new. And it's like, right, this new diet approach works, but ignore the foundation. So I think that's one of them that drives us insane. I think the biggest one that really, I still can't believe it's a thing. And people, I didn't realize, someone told you the other day, it's still pulling in like over 500 million a year, is this detox. And it's well established. It's not a thing. Like, otherwise, if the body required a juice cleanse or a detox cleanse using products, well, then we've completely evolved, and we've evolved overnight.
So that's what your organs are for.
Ultimately, that's what they are. Your liver and kidneys are perfectly capable of doing that. Unless you've got a severe problem with them, then we don't need to be spending X amount of money, because ultimately all you're doing is you're just removing all of the things that would have been toxic. So whether it'll be, a good example is you go on a stag do or a hen do for 4 days to Ibiza or wherever it is, then you come back, you're probably not going to feel great, like, because you've consumed like the whole of the Mediterranean Sea and vodka and cheap beer, and then you stop that, and all of a sudden 5 days later you feel like normal again. but that's because you've stopped doing the thing that ultimately was causing that. And it's the same thing when it comes to this detox. Like people say they feel great, and you will, because you've cut out all of the processed and ultra processed foods and all of the toxins that can have an impact.
I've heard
And
this countless times with people who've started carnivore or any other kind of or intermittent fasting, like you said, or any kind of, I don't want to call them fads, but they're a mode of expressing your diet in a different way. But they'll all, as soon as they do something that's different from what they were doing before, which, and the only reason they feel better for it is because, like you said, they've removed an element that was making things bad, but it's not necessarily the thing that they've changed to. By changing, they've just removed something else. But because they've had some success, they've created that internal bias that now says, but this works because I've seen it work and my mate's seen it work.
yeah,
Therefore, nothing else does, and this does.
yeah. I mean, from a from a health perspective, we talk about some of those dietary fads. Intermittent fasting is quite a common one. But ultimately it comes down to intermittent fasting is it's a meal timing strategy.
Hmm.
Like it isn't there is no magic metabolic trick or switch that's happening here. And if we think about the body of evidence that's sort of available, like and we look at systematic reviews and we look at umbrella reviews, that there is some evidence there to show that there is sometimes a reduction in body weight and fat mass and an improvement in insulin sensitivity. Also improvement in triglyceride profiling, which is sometimes linked to cardiovascular risks. But it's normally associated with people who are overweight or obese. And then the nuance to that is that when we match calories and protein, so if we took a traditional or a conventional diet that inputted a calorie restriction, but we matched calories and protein to intermittent fasting processes, then everything seems to be similar. Like IF doesn't outperform the
Yeah,
conventional approach. So it's one of those where, again, if you are looking for a dietary approach to lose weight, and intermittent fasting works for you, that's great. But if you want performance outcomes, then maybe that could have an impact on that because you might not be eating at particular times that you need to be eating, to fuel that performance or fuel the work that you're going to be doing, and then ultimately recover from that. So, it's ultimately, I think, and with IF, this is the misconception, I think, is that I think many people feel it's easier because they're eating less,
Mhm.
but that's ultimately what's making it easier. Because intermittent fasting, like I said, isn't a magical switch. There is no magic metabolic effects happening that is speeding up that process. It comes down to then that energy
Well,
balance, I suppose.
I'm no different. I mean, my preference is I would rather have most of my food later on in the day. I find it much easier to do without earlier in the day
Yeah,
because doing without later in the day is, for me, it's horrible. Like, I hate the feeling of sitting on the sofa at night knowing that I've got nothing left for the rest of the day. I would much prefer to make myself feel fuller in the later hours, maybe between 4 and 8 o'clock. So I'm not going to go to bed hungry. But I also train in the morning. So I know for
yeah,
a fact I can't do it. I can't do it that way. So I've got to try and find some sort of balance that allows me to front load a certain amount of macros in the morning to help me gym sessions, then maybe taper off into the middle of the day where I feel I can get away with it, and then bring things back in later on in the day where I know psychologically I'm going to need it. And
yeah.
I don't think there's any particular right or wrong there. It's getting that structure right for the person based on their preferences and what they're doing.
Oh, 100%. And Phil, that's what it comes back to. So ultimately, what you've explained there is a concept you'll have heard, and that we use in performance environments is periodization. It's
Mm.
fueling the work that's required, and ultimately we can take that to day by day, and meal by meal. So, like you say, there you train in the morning. If you're then having high carbohydrate breakfast because you train in the morning, and then post training, you would then have your carbs and protein. Then you're saying you're tapering that down. Well, I can understand why, because you don't need that amount of carbohydrate in those hours. But then towards the night time, you're then starting to put that sort of fuel back in the tank again, so that glycogen's going back in the muscles, ready for that following day.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately the way to do that in terms of fueling, what we call in the elite world is fueling the work required. And it just comes down to the basics of what I always use, and I use this quite often to get my athletes to understand, is the 3 T's. It comes down to the timing of when you eat, the type of food that you eat, and the total amount of that food that you eat. And if you get those three right, you'll see a huge impact in performance or your goal-based objective. But on the flip of that, I understand, like, I'm sort of talking there that we're living in an age where we're not just exposed to absolutely any form of information at any given second. Particularly now with the rise in AI, you can just pick up your phone and ask it a question, and it'll spit back, anything that you've asked it. It might not necessarily be true, by the way, because I've seen some research around the use of AI, and it was quite funny. This year I was having an argument with a professor who was like, "How many R's are in strawberry?" And it came back and said 2, and he was like, "Are you sure?" And the AI was like, "Yes." He was like, "Are you sure it's not 3?" And it was like, "No." I'm pretty sure there's 3 in there. So you have to be careful of that. But coming back to what I'm saying is that that requires a little bit of cognitive thinking, whereas I think people want the answer and they want it yesterday, and that's just not how it works. And I do believe that's why people end up flying off onto juice detoxes, why we go down a particular nutritional strategy, because they've seen that it worked for this person. But ultimately what people have to remember is that they are unique. While our systems are the same in terms of our skeletal system, cardiorespiratory system, it doesn't always work on the same continuum. Because if that was the case, then we could train and remodel and anyone could be anything. So, a sprinter, I'm never going to be a sprinter, never in my life. I'm never going to be fast, because my fiber typology and my genetic code and RNA and DNA ain't going to allow it. Now, I can move the dial a little bit through training and nutrition, but I am never going to be fast. And that's something that, we have to, as practitioners, we have to try and educate people on, but it can become quite difficult, because these diets and these approaches, they all get promoted as a blanket, don't they? There's never a, by the way, intermittent fasting may help you if you're type 2 diabetic. It's like intermittent fasting. I lost X amount of weight, and you can do it too. Pays $1,000, and then we'll do it, and people will. But yeah, it's one of them where I think we're in that world now, and we have to, as practitioners, I think we've got that responsibility of trying to weed through everything and finding strategies and approaches to best educate our clients. And I know you do, and there's a lot of people out there that are trying and really successful with it. And it's great to see. But on the flip of that as well, I also see that there's people that are just there, and they're there to make as much money as they can. And I think, is unethical probably not the word I'm looking for, unethical, but I think you haven't got the client's interest, the best interest at heart. Ultimately, what I'm sort of trying to say that I see quite a bit, because otherwise you wouldn't be, flogging snake oil in a jar and being happy doing that.
What about hydration? Is that something that you focus a lot on as well? Because I mean, I know it's essentially not nutrition as we understand, but it's certainly part of it.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And
a lot of the people who I'll have initial conversations with, and I'll say, like, just out of curiosity, how much do you drink? They'll be like, "Oh, quite a lot, at least 2 liters a day." I'm like, okay.
yeah,
I have 2.5 liters probably before 9 o'clock in the morning.
yeah, hydration is massive, and I say this all the time, and again, I come from, in my practice and I work on the foundations and build up from there. And I always say this, have a conversation. I'll do it again when we go back in pre-season. There's two free performance metrics. You get them for free. They cost you nothing. You don't have to spend anything. It doesn't impact your life. One of them's sleep and the other one's hydration. Get those two right. You can have a massive impact on performance anyway, because contrary to popular belief, people think that the training, the lifting the weight, the sprinting, the jumping is where the adaptation occurs. It's not. The adaptation occurs through rest and through recovery. And one of those key aspects is sleep. And then the second bit is that hydration. 2% dehydration can have a profound impact on performance. And it's often just overlooked. And I just think to myself, get that bit right. It has such an impact on, if we go right like into molecular and cellular side of things, like nutrient transportation, it serves so many different purposes. The reason why we would die if we didn't consume water or enough fluid in a short space of time, as opposed to not eating for a prolonged period of time. It's one of those where, and again, I think people, because it's an ease, it's like, well, what, just drinking that water? Like, we want that extra bit that comes with it, and water with bells and whistles on. Well, no, it doesn't. I suppose the next bit, if we go back, it leads into this, where I'm going now, is like, this electrolyte craze. I understand, I get it. Like, electrolytes are vastly important, but not to somebody, who isn't, saying that if you sweat a lot, I understand that, like your sweat rate, but then we need to see what the composition of that sweat is. If you're not engaged in vigorous like exercise and training, then maybe you don't need them to an extent now, where I'm seeing people having, 3 and 4 electrolyte tablets a day. Well, it's going to have an impact on blood pressure. It's going to have an impact on blood volume, blood flow. Like, you don't need that. And I think, again, it's, hydration, and I've had this where they'll say, well, I'll drink that, but if you put a hydration tablet in it, so, well, I don't necessarily need that, but I need to find a way of getting that person to consume the water, and it's actually just the flavour. So if we can get a flavoured effervescent or a flavoured sparkling water, then somebody may drink it. And that's an example where I've had to deal with that, but it's again, I do think it just comes down to, like, it's too easy for somebody.
Yeah.
Like, I just have to drink that. Yeah, that's all you have to do. Like, consume 2.5, 3 litres of water. Or if you're engaged in, particularly in summertime, and if you go to the gym that I go to and there's no air conditioning, then your water requirements will increase. Maybe then there's a role for an electrolyte, but people forget that these electrolytes are in food. And yeah, okay, maybe not in sufficient amounts for elite athletes and people who are, engaged in, rigorous nutrition protocols or rigorous training. But for the general person who goes to the gym to keep themselves, healthy or, psychologically in a good place, then we just need to focus on just having a little bit more water. And granted, not everybody likes sitting drinking water.
My kids do it, and me and my wife go, we'll go mad with our little one, especially like first thing on the morning, and when he comes in from school before I take him to football. I'm like, you cannot be going out playing football if you've hardly drank anything at school all day. You've just had your tea, and you've still got a full glass of water there. You haven't drank. Like, you're not going until you've drank it. Yeah. And I keep telling them it's going to impact your performance. It's going to impact your winning.
Oh, and like I say, we come back to that metric there. 2% dehydration can have, upwards to 10 to 20% impact on performance.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that the key bit is just trying to find little areas and little strategies where you can, where that can become a habit. And even them, I've seen them little bottles where it's got, the little markers on. That might work for somebody because it's a little bit of like accountability. I need to do this. But I suppose what I try and do is I try and look at, when I try and get people to, hydrate properly. and there's ways of measuring it in terms of, stand on a scale before you go out and train, and then, you come back and we can see that the difference in body mass. But I think before you even get there, I think there's like an area of like, right, okay, then so talk to us about, because a lot of it is around, talk to us around like what you eat. And then we need to say, well, actually, what are you drinking as well? Like, and some people just don't. They'll have maybe it's a coffee in the morning, or there's a lot of as you can imagine, coffee drinkers in athletic fields now. But some people are massive tea drinkers, and I think that's more of our generation thing than it is the new generation drinking tea. But again, tea is a diuretic, and they can obviously make you expend water. So there's little swaps you can possibly do, and I never, again, I never ever dismiss these little simple swap approaches, or little goal for that week. That window between you having your lunch where you've had sparkling water, and then leaving to go to the gym and you buy a bottle of water. That's like 6 hours. In between there, can we put a fluid in there, and that can be the goal for the week, and then that becomes habitual, and then we can build on that to a point where now they're consuming enough fluid. Like, can we now start focusing this hydration strategy in and around training, or wherever they may be?
It's
So
become
our
such
way,
a habit for me. My wife's exactly the same. If I don't have this next to us somewhere, if I go out somewhere and I don't have this next to us, I
yeah,
start like I get so dry, I get so
yeah,
thick because I've just actually become so accustomed to sipping fluid all the time.
yeah, and that's the key thing, and again, it's nothing groundbreaking, and I'm privileged that I get to work with a fantastic psychology team, um, and because a lot of nutrition strategies, or nutritional issues, if we want to call them that, um, stem from behavior. So then, if we can then put a process in place to modify that behavior, and then long term we can develop habits that are beneficial, then that's the way in which I go with that, and doing that has been unbelievable in terms
What's
of.
what's some of the key behaviour changes that you've seen or had to deal with or help change with some of the guys you work with in football?
So one of the big things, and it's not just in academy settings. I think it's in sort of intermittent sports across the globe. I think is under fueling. So one of the key things that I seen when I went in there was under fueling. So we had to try and change that, and we changed that by, again, using that process driven sort of approach. So if I take individual A, I noticed that they're not really fueling properly for this game. Pre-match, a little bit of a little bit of carbs there, more protein than there is carbs. So right, okay, how can we approach this? And we just sort of went, right, okay, and so what I want you to do is just divide your plate up. Again, simple process, but massive, right? So your plate needs to be half carbohydrate, quarter protein, and then a quarter of colour. And all we do there is we just make sure that what's available in terms of foods is low fat, low fiber, easy digestible. So it might be water based, cucumber, lettuce, whatever it might be. And that all of a sudden now they've changed their approach to where they're fueling better. Right, what's the next bit with that individual? So game day plus one, don't necessarily, and said they can't eat because they haven't slept very well, which tends to happen with footballers. So they don't feel like eating. Right, okay, what can we do now to try and get the right calories and right macronutrients into the player? Because we now need to recover. We're playing again in 2 days. So
Why do they
why do
struggle
you
with
try?
sleep?
Sorry.
Why do they struggle with sleep in particular?
I
Or
think it's just because the adrenaline, norepinephrine, and all those hormones are still surging. It takes them a long time to then dissipate, and generally we play on a night time. Um, so if we kick off, say 7 o'clock, then finish by 9:30, shower, they'll eat, they'll go home, and then it's like 11, 12 o'clock. They wind down, 1, 2. Sometimes we're in the next day. and we're in the next day because we've went from playing to now game day -2. So we need to recover, refuel, and then get ready for the following day. Don't get us wrong, I'm not naive enough to know that some of them will just be sat playing Call of Duty or FIFA.
Yeah.
That's just the way of the world these days. Um, but yeah, simple strategy there would be right. Can we utilize the smoothies that are available to them? So we may compensate, say, some of the nitrates or the anti-inflammatory properties that are in the smoothie to increase the carbohydrate. And that worked, and that's a player that I've worked with. And you have to do that across each individual, and eventually that collective now, where we've started with a significant underfueling, now we've completely changed, and it's all through simple process-driven goals, identifying opportunities where we can place something that is not too strenuous. And I think that's the key bit, is that I see a lot of practitioners and individuals themselves just placing something into a strategy that requires so much in one go, and that's where I think it can break down. Like, the goal has to be achievable. Again, we're going back to the basics of psychology here, but the basics and foundations are there for a reason, because they're effective, and you make it like an identifiable issue which requires the least resistance to modification. That could simply be swapping out a can of Coke for a can of Diet Coke. Now, I know people will still say, well, it's still not ideal. But yeah, but we're making a progress here, and it's not that resistance based. Like, someone will say, right, okay, and I'll give that a go. Instead of having 6, I'll have 3 Diet Cokes and 3 normal Cokes. And that's an extreme example, by the way, but and then, well, we'll go 4, then we'll go 5, then we'll go 6, then we'll start reducing. And again, I know we're talking about there that somebody has time, and I appreciate when it comes to different population groups, i.e. bodybuilding, boxing, judo, all those weight category sports, sometimes time isn't there. So we may have to place a level of severity and resistance on an athlete or a client in order to achieve the goal. But what I have found is that those people that are involved in this aspect, so bodybuilding, boxing, judo, mixed martial arts, they have a very, very particular mindset, and it's a mindset of I will. And then what I've found, and this is just my experience of working in boxing in the past, is that they're great for 12 weeks. And I get why they then say, well, I've just been on this nutrition strategy for 12 weeks. I'm going to Five Guys. And I get that and I understand that. Sometimes we end up in that circle of yo-yo. So great for 12 weeks, terrible for 12, great for 12. But the key point is we can still put in long-term behaviour adaptations that may then spill into that off bit. So yeah, we may have to place a little bit more resistance, but the resistance isn't as bad, because I find that those population groups are very susceptible to the change. So they will say, right, okay, I can't eat that, no problem. I'll eat X.
Yeah. I've got an American client who, one of the first changes I made to his diet was I just swapped all his drinks out from full fat monsters to zero sugar monsters. It was literally the first change. And I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't even get started is because they think they've got this mindset, or that they have this mindset of, if I'm going to do something, it has to be all or nothing. It has to be an extreme thing, because that's what I've heard works, and I haven't got time for it at the moment. So if I haven't got time to do all of that, there's little point in doing half of it, which is completely like the false way around. It needs to be a bit more of a iterative approach. You need to kind of almost look at, well, what can you add now and get used to, then what can you add after that, and then what can you add after that, not just go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. It's what can we keep adding in and build a resilience to, and then increase from there.
Again, I think it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, isn't it? It's what makes our industry unique, because you get that, don't you? You get someone that's like, right, come on then. Well, I've got 7 weeks and want to do this, and you you then have to try and do it ethically. You have to do it safe. But some people you can't tell. They'll just go off and they'll do. You'll tell them to say, you'll say, right, I want you to include a little bit more protein and remove this. Next thing they've got the full cattle in their back garden. And do you know what I mean? And you're like, well, why you bought 12 cows where you said increase protein? Whoa, hang on. I didn't see, do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's what makes it unique for us, because then we have to try and find that way of psychologically, right, okay, how do I get this individual, like, to not so much conform, but, start, maybe he's putting the brakes on a little bit,
Mm.
to the other extreme, which you'll have seen as well, is where, you say to somebody, right, okay, we're just going to have this sort of little change. And if we take the really good example there, the monster example, and then you say, oh, but I thought you were going to swap them out. Oh, I forgot. You have that extreme as well, which I think is part and parcel of what makes our roles unique. Because
I
we're
think a lot of
constantly,
the time as well, sometimes you've just got to let people make some mistakes first,
yeah,
and that might take weeks, it might take months, but then ultimately once they've made that and they come back to you and say, why is nothing happening? And
yeah,
you show it back to them why it's not happened, then the penny drops. But that's,
yeah,
to be honest, I find that just as valuable as the people who get it right first time, if anything more valuable, because they've had to learn from it. So now there's a real understanding rather than, don't get us wrong, it's nice when you've got clients who you start them off and they just hit the ground running and everything works perfectly. That's
yeah,
great. But at the same time, when they haven't got any of it wrong, they've not come out the other side, and the people who've got it wrong have then learned something valuable about themselves, and it's something that
yeah.
they can then swap out and change, and that'll last a long time.
Yeah, and I think that's the ultimate goal, and as long as they fail at whatever they achieved and it's safe and it's in an ethical manner, then you're absolutely right. That provides just as much insight and information as there is to someone who absolutely smashes it. And again, it comes down to some people are driven by that result, and that's the kickstart they need, or and I think it's it's really important that we utilize all those different skill sets that's available to it to ultimately help people develop, because that's ultimately what we want, isn't it? We want people to make lifestyle changes
Mm.
that are beneficial long term. Um, and there's nothing better, you know yourself, when you know somebody a little bit different for you, because I'm in that position where we're striving to make football players, and that doesn't mean that we don't put long term values and behaviour changes in. But some people may come to you in a way that when a bad, like maybe it's a bad place, and starting from a negative place, and ultimately the work you've done with them, they've now completely transformed their life. Um, and that's what we're there for. Ultimately, what we're wanting to do, we want people to be the best versions of themselves. I mean, that's ultimately why I do what I do. Is um, that's what I'm bothered about. How can I support you to become the best version of yourself? Because I don't want you to be anything other than that.
Mm.
And if that means, we have a little play around with your nutrition strategy, and we bump heads now and then, and or we jumpy high five each other when we get somewhere, that's fantastic. But ultimately, I just want the long term
I've,
best for
I've
you.
had a I've had a couple of conversations recently about balance and this idea of um, people they won't adhere to something because they've got this other bias, this other mindset that says, yeah, but I don't want to have to be so strict that I live like a monk for the rest of my life. And I totally understand it, but at the same time, the answer was yes, but you do want to change as well. So you have
Yeah,
to understand that for a certain length of time, there is some sacrifices that are going to have to be made.
yeah,
If you want balance all the time, you can have it, but then don't expect that change that you want to happen to happen.
yeah.
Like one of your footballers is not going to become the best footballer he can be if he says, but I've trained really hard all week. I deserve to go out at the weekend and blow it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, it does. It's one of those areas, isn't it, where it comes again. We talk about psychology, sort of that. work and reward,
Mhm.
almost like sort of Pavlov's theory of like, well done, there's a reward. And sometimes people work and operate like that. But unfortunately, in the athletic world, um, then, ultimately, just eating health, or the perceived cultural norm of healthy, or, well, I want to be able to go out on a Friday, or I want to do a Saturday and eat whatever, and it's in the middle of preparing for a competition. Well, that's a mindset issue that you're going to have to change if you want to be the very best you can possibly be. Um, and otherwise it ain't going to work, because the next person is doing what's required.
Mhm.
Um, and it's the same in I suppose sports, where ultimately, those 2 days become 4, 6, 8, 10 over the course of a year, like, and the number increases, or over the course of a of
What would
a
you tell your footballers? Like, okay, once the season's done and you've got that month or so off between training starting again, where things can relax, that's the time where you can reintroduce balance and
yeah,
maybe have some of those things. But then once things switch back into game mode and you've got to be performing at your best, you have to understand that there's got to be some give and take. Like
yeah,
you can't do that anymore. And again, it's
yeah, and
periodization again, isn't it?
I think that I suppose it comes down to um the exercise sort of modality. I suppose I'm in a world where, it's intermittent in terms of its approach, which means that fuel usage is, ramped up on particular days, and then it's switched on other days where we'll be utilizing fat more as a fuel source, and carbohydrate. So we've got the sort of the beauty to be able to manipulate nutrition, because that's ultimately what we're doing. But we can manipulate it on a basis, in and around cultural variations, religious variations, likability. So, for instance, after a game, you know, our lads, um, some of them may have a blueberry muffin, or some of them may have carrot cake. Well, I can get away with that in terms of, because of what I need to then put back in, as opposed to somebody that's in a competition phase, say bodybuilding, or making weight. Maybe you can't after you've training. Like, we've got to be a little bit more stringent and a little bit more strict. But again, that comes down to the exercise modality and the goals that are there. So my goal after a game is, right, recovery. Um, Whereas, you've probably got to make sure that actually we need to recover from the session, of course, because we need to adapt. But we also need to be mindful that we're 2 weeks into a 12-week program, and we've got to stand on a stage in 10 weeks' time. So it becomes slightly different in terms of that. So what I tend to do is I try and, gather that information. Well, I'll have all that information anyway from an initial consultation, in terms of culture, likes, dislikes. I find out who does all the cooking. I'll find out who influences the food nutrition intake. I'll find out who takes the kids to school, who picks them up, and we work around that, and we can then build nutrition strategies and interventions based on all of that information. Um, and we can make it so it's not too restrictive. But I think, again, a little bit of creativity. And I mean, I've just well, I'm saying that I have finished it. It just needs proofread, but I've just wrote an ebook around performance periodization, and just matching sort of recipes to different, so just basic high, medium, and low training days. And you'd be amazed at some people who are like, "What can I can eat that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you can eat that, but that would look very different if I put that into a different sport."
Mhm.
Um, so again, I think the the variation of foods is important in terms of adherence, but I think consistency is what drives the long term behaviour, and that variation can have an impact on adherence. Because some people may say that, oh, it becomes boring, it becomes mundane.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I tend to try and, if that, is the case, I try and, make the staple of that nutrition strategy the same, and then we have variations of sort of the same meal, because we know that consistency is going to create that long term, habitual change. But again, it is individual, and you will have extremes where, and I've worked with people where they're like, I want something new every day, for my breakfast, and then right, okay, and I suppose you've got to try and then start that other end of the spectrum that we spoke about. But there's loads of variations of like overnight oats you can use, loads of different pastas, rice dishes. But yeah, I think the key, I think, for anybody really is that the consistency is what's going to, draw that behavior change and have a profound impact rather than, and don't get us wrong, if you've got time on your hands and you love food, and then like all for chopping and changing and becoming a wizard in the kitchen. But the reality is that becomes quite difficult. However, I mean, I've got, players who pay people in order to do that, so it becomes a little
Yeah.
bit more,
What I normally tend to tell people is, for your breakfast and lunches, the early parts of the day where you're maybe a bit more time bound, do you really need that many options? Like, can you get away with just having like a couple on repeat, and then save your evening meal when you've got maybe a little bit more time, you're back from work, you're with your family, then maybe look at having different meals on your evenings.
yeah,
I think that the easier you can make it and the more repeatable you can make it, the more consistent you can be. Once you start looking for too much variety, then you're introducing too many decisions, and the more decisions you have to try and make, the more likely you're going to make the wrong one and go off course and pick something that's completely not what you should be eating. Whereas if that decision's made for you because you've made the variables much more simple, then that drives consistency. I've
yeah,
not had too many people that complain too much about needing variety. I have found that it's more women than men that want more variety, whereas men tend to be much more. I'm happy just eating the same thing every day. Just tell us what I need to eat, and I'll eat it. Um,
yeah.
not to try and draw blanket statements, but I have actually got one guy who's the complete opposite. He's the one that wants variety, and his wife's not bothered. Um,
Yeah.
One thing I did want to look at, just for something maybe more tangible and useful for people listening, is have you got any? So when I was looking at your page in particular on Instagram, and I'll drop your handle in the link on the bottom of the podcast episode. In terms of actual foods that do different jobs, when we look at things like maybe healing injuries or recovery or
Yeah.
improving physical or mental performance, do you have any
Um,
good examples of things that most of the general population just might not be aware of, that could be a bit of an eye opener, or I didn't realize that,
um, yeah, I think
even on a supplemental point of view.
I think the key bit, I think, is from that sort of physical and mental well-being, and link this to injury, is that the misconception is that, well, they're injured now, so or there is an injury present, we don't train as much, which means that we need less, and that's not the case. Like, energy availability becomes the foundation of recovery, and it needs to make sure that where the energy is right from the start, because if we don't, we have reduced rehabilitation, or the training through rehabilitation quality. We're increasing further injury risk, we're slowing recovery. There's hormonal disruptions, reduced concentration and decision making, mood swings, general well-being. Like, these can all be impacted by that. So ultimately, the first thing I would say there is energy availability. So are you getting the right amount of energy that is required? And then I suppose,
What would you base that on? How would you try and create a number or a guidance around that?
I mean, the gold standard way would be, indirect calorimetry, which is a case of, you'll have seen this before. We lie down completely still, mask on, and there's a gas exchange that tells us what RMR, and it tells where that's coming from. Fantastic tool. So at rest, you may expend 1,300 calories, and it'll give you the breakdown of carbs, fat, and protein. And then generally from there, what you would tend to do is you would then tend to increase intensity of exercise with the same thing, and we can get that down to the calorie in terms of expenditure. Problem is we just haven't got access to that
Yeah.
So, and it becomes very, very expensive. So I think in general terms, I think there's a lot of, predictive equations out there, and I've done a lot of research on this actually, in terms of predictive equations based on gold standard measures. So we looked at indirect calorimetry. We looked at doubly labeled water, which is up there as the gold standard metric, where we use urine to establish energy expenditure. And what we found was in some circumstances that predictive equations were within a sort of acceptable error range of these when they were used correctly. So you can use that, and the St. Joe predictive equation, the most widely used, again, population specific, and there is different ones out there like the Cunningham equation, etc., but require different metrics at hand. So the Cunningham equation requires body fat percentage to be inputted, but that's a good guide for somebody to be able to do that, and work on a calorie aspect. I mean, I use a process called Hexis, really good nutrition software developed by two really prominent players within the performance nutrition field. And again, predictive equation is in there. I can add in things. So we've got Catapult, which does all our GPS, and then we've got First Beat, which is the heart rate sensor. But again, that's triaxial accelerometry. There's issues in and around that in itself. But when we start pairing these things together, we're starting to get a little bit more of an accurate impact in terms of energy expenditure. So once you've got that, well, then you can start thinking about, right, am I eating enough to match this? And that's one of the key things that I see quite a lot. Again, when it comes to, there is emerging research when it comes to injury, where vitamin C and collagen may have an impact on tendon stiffness when we have tendinopathies. So there is some value in that. We're still not 100% sure in terms of its efficacy, but the research is promising in it. And then we can then look at creatine. So what we're finding is, obviously, we know creatine's the most researched supplement out there, but what we're finding is that in terms of the rehabilitation, well, it's having an impact on the ability to get through that. So there may be some some promising sides to that as well. Plus,
What
as
kind of
well,
dosage, what kind of dosages are you running with players on creatine? Because it was always about the 5 grams a day, but then everything you read now is talking about 10 to 20 grams a day.
yeah, and I think again, I run 5 grams a day with the lads. I do that because I want to establish some consistency. There may be certain areas of rehabilitation where we might go loading with that. I'm not sure that 20 grams a day from a musculoskeletal performance standpoint, I stand to be corrected here, but I haven't seen any compelling research telling me that that's the new way forward. Because
No,
once,
everything I've seen lately is more pointed towards your 5 grams certainly is enough for saturating muscle cells, but then anything above that is where you start to get more cognitive benefits.
yeah, I was going to say I've seen bits and pieces around the cognitive aspect of that. I mean, hey, again, but again, I think the cognitive aspect is very population specific, and that there's a lot more research to be done in terms of being able to, or what we call ecological validity, which means that we can translate that across multiple populations. But at the minute, I'm pretty sure it's been done in people that have had brain injuries or suffering, unfortunately, from maybe Alzheimer's, or dementia. So until we get that, I use that dosage. Might be if there's an injury there, we may increase that and we'll load it. But then we load that, 7 to 14 days, and then it comes down to that 5%. 5 grams. So yeah, I'm not sure plowing in 20 grams of creatine is going to do anything beyond the point of saturation.
Yeah.
Again, I think protein, particularly in injuries, we maybe need to go beyond that 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. I mean, we now know that going beyond that doesn't necessarily translate into the accumulation of lean mass. But because the trauma's there, the protein turnover might be greater. We probably look now to increase that from anywhere from 1.6 to 2.5 grams of
Would you say
protein.
there's any downsides or risk to overdoing protein?
Um, I don't think that downsides are potentially that if you consume too much protein, like we spoke about before, we consume too much too much of any
All calories,
macronutrient.
calories being equal, though, if you
Yeah.
would heavily bias your macros towards protein, would you say there was any downsides to overdoing it? Because I understand that even if you kind of overdo to the point where it's not being utilized, it ends up having a cascading effect back down into other macros anyway.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes down to energy availability. That I think so. Um, what we tend to find, or what we found for a lot of years, or what we based our research based was, we'd have a dose of protein, say between 20 and 40 grams of protein. We'd measure muscle protein synthesis, and then we'd measure its impact. We'd measure its longevity. Um, but what you'd find it would rapidly rise, and then it would drop off. Because of the type of protein. So are we looking at fast protein in terms of whey proteins, or are we looking at now whole foods? But what we found now is that the bigger the dose, so if we move that to 80 to 100 grams, we still get that spike, but the drop off or return to baseline takes a lot longer.
Mhm.
So I think ultimately that's where people have said, right, well, um, the more protein I take, well, obviously muscle protein synthesis, I'm gonna get bigger. That's not necessarily the case, because then it comes down to energy availability, and then comes down to the things that we spoke about, where it's meal frequency. So if we're in a scenario where we're only going to be able to eat twice a day, right? Okay, then let's get one net protein intake in across those two meals. But if we're in a position where we can freely go about eating, well, 3 or 4 meals, whatever you might eat, then I would still have that even distribution of your net protein intake
Yeah.
across those meal patterns. So what I
But
found
does that
when I,
does that quash this idea that, when people say you're wasting your time having any more than 30 to 40 grams of protein in one sitting, because essentially your body's just going to waste it and it's not going to get used. But you're saying even if you do go higher, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You're going to get a longer drop off. It's still going to get utilized. It all depends more about meal timing than anything else.
well, yeah, so meal timing and net protein intake. Ultimately, net protein intake now becomes very important. So, yeah, I suppose the answer to that is that if you increase your protein intake and it meets your net protein intake, well, then it won't be wasted. And I suppose, again, that term there, wasted, it's not necessarily being wasted, because there are, obviously, we know protein's built up with amino acids. Some of those amino acids are used in the gluconeogenesis process. So if we go back to somebody who's keto or very low carbohydrate, and they're engaged and the thing is with fuel, I think a good little analogy here with fuel usage. So if we think about how that's worked, they never switch off. So carbohydrate fuel usage never gets fully turned off. Neither does fat. What happens is it's more like a light dim switch. The higher the intensity of the exercise, the switch goes up on carbohydrate, the switch comes down on fat. And then as the intensity drops, fat increases, carbohydrate comes down. But if we're engaged in high intensity exercise or extremely low carbohydrate, eventually what will happen is that process of gluconeogenesis will kick in, and we have to get some form of carbohydrate from somewhere, and then that's what happens. It turns over some aspects of the amino acid profile from protein, which is the process of protein turnover. But there isn't necessarily a downside to it in terms of, right, well, I've consumed this amount of protein. I think that the key bit is, are you getting enough based on the net protein intake, which we now know is 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight? And how you then deliver that will depend on circumstances around how much meal frequency you get. But timing becomes very, very important. And if I was to cite any research around protein metabolism, it would definitely be Professor Phillips, definitely Professor Aragon, and Professor Kirksick. They have, and they, if you even search them, they've got some really good info there where they've took scientific info and broke it down into really digestible pieces of information.
Brilliant. Chris, I'm conscious of time. I know you need to get away. It's fantastic chatting, really, really useful. I think it'll be very useful for people listening as well. If anyone wanted to learn more about what you do, where can they find you?
I mean, you can find us on Instagram, but bear with us if you contact us because I'm useless with it. I do bits on Pinterest, TikTok, but that's more really football based, whereas the Instagram's probably the best place to catch us on there. Also on my website, which is just simply cc-nutrition.co.uk. And also a little plug. I've just created 2 ebooks, so they're going live today. But I'll fire those out on Instagram at some point today. But no, fantastic chatting. It's always good having a chat with people in different industries, and because at the end of the day, it's always you're always learning, and you can get a little bit channeled. And for the last 5-6 years, I've just been in football, and I've really started now branching out and speaking to other practitioners, speaking to people like yourself in other industries, just to pick up some new skills, some new ways of thinking, and certainly done that today. So thank you very much.
Cool. Brilliant. No, I appreciate it, Chris. Nice one.
And yeah, we'll catch up.
soon.
Yeah,
Nice one.
definitely. Take care,
Cheers, mate.
Phil.